Hello, good morning, and welcome to this session on netizens, engagement and empowerment. My name is Shiv Malik, I work for The Guardian, and I am the moderator for this session. I've got to remember to speak a little bit slower if for translation's sake. Is anyone here? Okay, actually, is anyone here using translation? Not for the moment, okay. One, okay, I'll definitely keep my pace a little slower. And can we also remember to keep the pace slow for those people? So I'm going to change the title just a little bit. Anthony here from the OECD is getting now worried. I'm going to call it the new engagement and empowerment of people, because I think we've seen 150 years of this, but we've reached a new point, if you want. Just over the last 4 years, we've seen the power of social media, of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube to affect change. Whether it's in Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, or now the Ukraine, social media can undoubtedly bring ordinary citizens together in ways like never before. Armed merely with an internet connection and a smartphone, these new tools have coalesced protest movements and spread their messages, news, and information beyond often the reach of any state authority. We've also seen how in Syria, social media can be used to inform the outside world about the conflict. On one hand, inspiring fellow jihadists to travel to the war-torn country. On the other, exposing the use of chemical weapons, leading to the unprecedented disarming of a dictator. But away from the extreme edge of revolution, what are the longer-lasting effects of citizen engagement? You might say also longer-lasting or deeper effects of this. Well, what we've already witnessed, the rise of the netizen, the citizen of the internet, if you want, which has been described as, or defined as, persons who heavily engage in civic and political affairs using online technologies. So as trust in government continues to lag, our netizens seem to be shaping new forms of civic engagement. They can also reach, obviously, broad audiences across the globe in hours, if not minutes, and they are clearly keeping the political class on their toes. In essence, they tell the political class what they want. They don't want to be dictated by policy wonks in think tanks and by politicians who seem to know best for what should be done. So we're going to ask, in fact, in this session now, as people come in, whether people need politicians at all. We're going to also ask, in a minute or two, we're also going to hear from Anthony Gooch about one manifestation of this new civic engagement. He will present the OECD's Better Life Index. And since its launch in 2011, the BLI has received over 3.6 million visits and received over 60,000 responses from users. We're going to hear a bit more from Anthony about that very shortly. But we should also ask some other questions. Will it unite groups with shared concerns across communities, regions, and countries, or divide people like never before, perhaps, as people are siloed into smaller and smaller groups? Are these people proper citizens? Are these netizens, in fact, the kind of things that we'd imagine in the Greek agora, shaping the debate and being mindful of the entire big picture? Or are they just good at complaining? Are these new netizens also disenfranchising other groups, the elderly, the poor perhaps, and crowding out everyone else who wants to get in, who would have otherwise got a look in? So, that's enough from me. We're going to come to our panel very shortly, but after we go to Anthony. But this is just a reminder about how the session will run. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from Anthony, then we're going to have about 20 to 25 minutes from the panel. We're going to be asking questions. We're going to try and explore this concept of what a netizen is. Then we're going to go out to you, the audience, and ask you some questions. And hopefully, you'll also have questions of your own. I'm going to come on to explain how you can post your questions using our tool, Wisembly, in a second. But there's also, obviously, the hashtag. The general hashtag is OECD a week, but you'll know specifically for this forum event, it's OECD Red. RED, as in the Red Amphitheatre. On Wisembly, so if you want to post us a question by SMS, by Twitter, by all the interactive tools that we're going to be talking about, I think, except maybe by Instagram, it doesn't work on that, then you find the instructions under your seat, beside your seat. Okay, next to your seat, yes, around your seat area. Ask the person next to you in case they've stolen it. And hopefully we'll be able to get your questions up behind us, and I'll be picking out some favorites to ask our panel. But we can just go for the old traditional method if you're not in favor of the new Netizen way of doing things, and just put up your hands. But we're going to do that in about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to come back to the panel, and then we're going to come back out to you, to the audience again. We've got about an hour, so we're going to keep this very fast moving. So, now that's all explained. Am I missing anything? No? Okay, well, we're going to hear from Anthony Gooch, who's going to explain the findings of the BLI. Thank you very much. Give him a round of applause. He deserves one.
Thank you very much indeed, Shiv. No, the reason that we invite Shiv here is because he shakes things up. We're in what someone described as the red light district of the OECD forum yesterday. I discovered this room yesterday evening. I think it's fantastic. Very appropriate for what we're going to discuss this morning. So I'm going to move speedily on. Some of you are knowledgeable on the Better Life Index, and some of you may not be knowledgeable, so don't worry about it. It's basically, as Shiv said, we're using it now as an example of reaching out to the netizen, engaging and empowerment, and it's something that we're also interested in having people's views on in and of itself as an example thereof. So I'm going to kick off by engaging you. What makes you happy? This is a question that you can well imagine is actually very much at the heart of the Better Life Index, as its title suggests. And as I go through my presentation now, what I'd like you to do is think about this question, and using those various channels, which I think are on orange cards in your seats, as Shiv has just described, provide us with a one word of what it is, if you like, that well-being is for you, that makes you happy. What would that one word be? And we'll come up at the end with some of the results on that. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you a very short story, but it's important that you understand this, because where have we come from here at the OECD in terms of going down this road, if you like, of netizen engagement and empowerment? When I joined the OECD, this was our landscape. You know, we essentially were focused on governments, and we have representatives of governments here at our ministerial. It's the high point of our year. But a very classic scenario, I would say, there in terms of policy making and international organizations. What we identified around 2008, which was a coincidence of events, I joined here, and the biggest crisis in the history of this organization, which has been going for over 50 years, suddenly hits us. Is that lineup of stakeholders enough in a situation like that, when you have millions of people around the world who are suffering? And we're looking at something that's missing there. Who is it that we actually do all these things for? Who puts governments in place? This organization is an organization of democracies. It wasn't in 1960, but it is today. If you want to be in it, stay in it, and join it, you have to be a democracy. And democracies have people at the center of them. So that was the missing element, if you like, there. The biggest crisis that I've mentioned in 50 years we've brought us also to start to reach out in a far more broader way. And now what you're seeing in front of you is a far more holistic vision, but one where we're actually putting citizens at the center of what we do rather than ourselves. That's the normal thing that organizations do. So it was all about me. Actually, everything we do is all about them ultimately. We know that, but we needed reminding of it. So when we look at the context as well, here we're talking about netizens, and we're making a little effort to try and define a netizen. What are the characteristics that we would say mark you out? Engagement, online, as the net would suggest, influential, global, and global in a sense of borderless, because the netizen is not necessarily bound as the citizen is by national boundaries or, say, by regional boundaries. Citizens are obviously defined by their citizenship, what provides them citizenship, and there are responsibilities in there. So there are some very interesting elements that mark the netizen out relative to the citizen. I'd like to come on also to the context that we hit upon in 2008. This is the stuff that's going on that we're having to respond to. Very reasonable. You'll see at the top, that's an Occupy demonstration. Democracy is an illusion. Below it, the Indignado movement that began in the center of Madrid. So there's a clear demand for engagement and there's a clear disaffection. So what can we do in order to respond as a consequence? And so in 2011, we work up towards it. We decide to launch a dialogue with citizens on what matters to them. We don't assume at the OECD that we know. We may have done that a little bit in the past. We're not assuming that we know today. We build it around the concept of well-being and quality of life. We build it around going beyond the concept of GDP, are these real measures of well-being and quality of life, and to ask people what actually matters to them. Without the engagement, we can't possibly do that. So, very quickly, it's a simple concept. You're asked to rate, create, and participate. I'll come back to more detail, but those of you who've engaged already, you'll know a little bit. It's really 11 dimensions of well-being that range from material elements like housing to include quality of life elements like education, work-life balance. You create your index. It's yours because you rank and the countries line up according to what is important to you. It's not an OECD index where we tell the world who's doing best. We do a lot of that. But this is one where you're at the center of it. And so what I'm going to tell you now is actually what you have told us. And it's a sneak preview because at 12 o'clock we do a press conference where we unveil this to the media. So we're giving you a sneak preview. Feel free to tweet and everything else about it. It's no problem. What have you told us in the last 3 years? Well, firstly, in 3 years, what we've seen, we've gone from a situation where this didn't exist to having almost 4 million people. And the interesting thing is from all the countries in the world. You can't see a country that isn't in blue. There may be a lighter and a dark shade. There are only there are only 36 countries that you can actually rank and measure in the index. The interesting thing is you've got people from 180 countries in the world wanting to engage on this topic. Obviously, the growth potential here, I need not dwell on. On participation. So there are 2 elements I'm going to discuss today. Participation on the one hand, that's when people come and have a look, and it's not engagement, it's not quite the same thing. Participation, interesting. We're broadening a great deal. 80% of those who are engaging with us, even after 3 years, are new. But we're building up a hard core, and that hard core is just over 20% of our users. These are the people with whom I would say we are starting to engage over time. So it's a combo of engagement, but also broadening. 4 million in the grand scheme of things isn't very much. 4 million for the OECD is quite unbelievable. You know, we didn't know those numbers really existed. We were really for the cognoscenti. The thing is that the cognoscenti in today's day and age are millions. And this crisis has brought us into that situation. Okay. Now, the key thing here is also to see what's happened in terms of the engagement. What we've really seen in the last year and what's allowing us to do what we're doing at this forum and today is the fact that things have gone through the roof in the last year. We've seen an increase of 36,000 indexes shared with us. So now we're into engagement. The people taking the time and trouble to actually tell us what they think is most important to them in terms of quality of life. And that has really grown exponentially in the last year. There are a number of reasons for that, and I'm going to go into it. But you see that curve is a very positive one for us because this is really what matters to us. It's not just having an interesting and a great website. It's the quality of what you're actually starting to get back from people and seeing that people do want to engage. There is a demand for this, and there's a supply we're providing. Also, the art of communication is as much about listening as it is about telling people things. How are things breaking down in terms of the netizens who are engaging? This is a little bit of a matter of concern for us because we see the gentlemen seem to be outnumbering the ladies by a proportion of about 60 to 40. There are a lot of people in the room who I know are helping us redress the balance, and I thank them for their help, because we don't really see why that is, but it is. And so it's something that perhaps the panelists may have thoughts on. The breakdown by age is fascinating as well, because we're able to see, okay, who are the netizens of the Better Life Index? We're seeing that the highest proportion range in the 15 to 34-year-old sphere. So it's clearly the generations of today. It's those who are on the younger end, and that's something maybe that we wouldn't consider so surprising. And yet, we believe, why not see a huge growth in, for example, those over 65s, and we'll obviously be hearing from Ken there, and even creating a category which is over 85s, what's known as the fourth age. And we'll be hearing a lot in this forum about aging. But that gives you the picture to date, very much a sort of a youngish person's phenomenon in what we're seeing. So let's also, I wanted to underline a very important element in this exercise: language. If you are to engage successfully the netizenry, I think what we have learned from our experience is that if you think English is enough, and I know that Thomas Piketty's book, because he translated it into English, suddenly everyone's reading about it. That book existed for a year and a half in French, and no one seemed to pick it up. That's a problem, but anyway. You need, the language element is critical. We have produced this index now, not only in English, in French, in German, in Spanish, and in Russian. Mainly, we've been following our stakeholders. Why did we produce a language version? Because the highest number of people visiting our English language site were from France. So we're responding to them. And that's a good reason, if you like, for doing it. And we will be growing those elements as a consequence. I want to show you an example of how language not only brings more visits, but it also brings more engagement. If you look at the case of Mexico, we launched the Índice para una Vida Mejor in May of last year. Those of you who are around may remember it. We've seen a huge increase in participation in Mexico in that period of time. We've had 3 times as many visits in the last year as we had in the 2 previous years. And also, the number of indexes that are being shared with us have gone through the roof in Mexico as well. So this isn't just about being able to read something. It's also saying, OK, now you're speaking to me in my language. OK, now I'm going to tell you what I really think. In German, we've just launched German in January. And what's happened in that case? Well, in the last 2.5 years, we managed to get just under 3,000 indexes shared with us. What's happened in the last 4 months since we've presented this index in German? We're almost there. Exactly the same figure in 4 months as it took us 32 months to achieve before. And this, again, is an example of how important language is in this exercise, and speaking to netizens in the language that they understand. That's what's going to empower them if we learn a lesson from here. So the 11 topics, I'm going to tell you very quickly what it is that people are telling us. You have the list on the right-hand side. You are asked to rate between 0 and 5 those 11 dimensions of well-being. The 3 top ones are material well-being. It's things like housing, income, and then you've got quality of life indicators as well. What has happened in those 3 years? This is the aggregate we're giving you. What's coming out most important, and this actually changed yesterday. So health has overtaken life satisfaction for the first time since the index exists over the last 3 years, and that actually we discovered it yesterday as we were finalizing preparations for today. So the top ranking dimensions of well-being for people, what they're telling us is health is number 1, life satisfaction, education, and work-life balance. Take a look at the end, civic engagement, and here we are talking about netizenry and engagement. Civic engagement, perhaps in the traditional sense, well, that's really falling off the scale, unfortunately. That's not even reaching 7% of the overall total, whereas you compare health is almost pushing to 10.5%. So, what about you? When you look at what I'm going to show you now, actually, is the new site that has just gone live this morning. And what we're going to be able to do is take a look at certain countries and how those countries are actually performing in response terms. So now this isn't ranking the countries, but it's actually ranking what people are telling us. And you're seeing the bubbles there. The bubbles denote the number of responses that we are receiving around the world. This site is now live, and it is literally live. The Better Life Index gets updated once a year. This is live and direct all the time. The moment we get a response from somewhere in the world, it is factored into what we are showing you today. So on the basis of the 60,000 indexes that we have received, there are two ways that you can look at the preferences that people are showing. On the one hand, it's the volumes, and on the other hand, you're able to see the issues that are of most importance to people. So whether it is housing, whether it is education, what is it that matters most to people in individual countries? So since we are in France, let's take a look at what the French have to say. First, I'm going to tell you that the French talk a lot to us. It's the second highest number of visits, but proportionately, in terms of the indexes that have been shared with us, it's easily the highest number there. So what are the French telling us? When you look at that little lineup, if you can see it, on the right-hand side, you see health is coming out top. It's the highest ranked topic. So that's, as we've just got globally, perhaps the French have influenced that position because of the high preponderance of engagers from there. We can see that users are younger in France than the global average. It's 15 to 24-year-olds who are the largest participating group, and that compares to the global average 25 to 34s. We can see here in France, thankfully, we have égalité entre les hommes et les femmes. We have 50-50 split. So those networks in the room, many of them are French. Thank you, merci beaucoup pour votre travail, because we're in a healthy situation here compared, I would say, to that 60-40 split that we see globally. We can also compare the responses, so it's not just seeing what one country, people in one country are choosing. Let's compare them. And in this case, why don't we compare them to the United States by way of example? Now, it's not so easy to view up on screen because of the reflector, but you may or may not be able to see that what we see is there are two topics that are switched. Life satisfaction is more important in the US than it is for the French. So it's French, it's health. In the US, it's life satisfaction. We can also see that housing is rated higher in France, and that users in both countries give similar ratings to education, work-life balance, jobs, and civic engagement. So this allows you also to be able to compare and say, okay, are people in different countries so different? And much of what we're going to be able to show you through this is that people don't actually split up on those geographical lines in the way we would think. Interesting, because netizens, as we know, they are borderless, so they're not so much thinking about the country. You can also compare with the average of all countries. So we can see that the four top topics in France are actually in line with the overall users. Now, an additional feature highlights the preferences that we have noted in particular countries. If you zoom over to Asia, what you see is that the Japanese and the Koreans, for them, it's safety first. Now, you know what's happened in Japan in recent years. We're talking about resilience here, a tsunami and a nuclear accident. So I think it's perhaps no surprise to see people there expressing certain differences regarding health and life satisfaction in certain countries. Well, if you zoom into those countries, for Korea, it's perhaps a slightly different reason why they're looking at safety, but there are those differences. Let's look over at Australia. For the Australians, they are seeking work-life balance. That's their number one concern as Australians who've used the index and shared with us. The Danes, the Germans, the South Africans, and the Swiss, they just want to be happy. And the Latin Americans, they want to go to school. They want to go to university. It's all about education, education, education. So, the evolution of global preferences overall, what we've seen is health has increased in importance in the last 3 years. Safety has increased in importance in the last 3 years, and jobs has decreased in importance in certain countries. However, if you look at countries like Greece or Spain, countries heavily hit by the euro crisis, you'll see a different picture when you're looking at jobs. So this is country by country, and the beauty is you'll be able to see that. Okay, well, this is all fine and dandy and wonderful, and I'm almost done, Shiv. So what? I'm going to tell you that recently here at the OECD, we have a great event today, but recently we were delighted to welcome the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, an important country for the OECD and a country that has suffered a great deal through this crisis. I want to show you a short footage from what the the Deputy Prime Minister had to say, and he was not prepped by us.
On our way into the hall just now, the Taoiseach and I were asked to score the quality of life indicators on the wall. And this is a very tricky exercise for the leaders of two parties in a coalition government, particularly when the television cameras are on us. And the interesting thing is that we did actually give different scores to the different indicators, but we ended up with the same result. And that, I think, has to be the secret of a good coalition government. We want Ireland to be at the very top of your better life indices. And that means, in the first instance, planning a route to full employment. We are, of course, also conscious that we are doing all of this not just to meet economic objectives, that ultimately achieving these economic objectives is about building a better quality of life, ensuring that we have better living standards, and that our population enjoys better health, a better environment, and safer communities.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It was absolutely fascinating, and we're going to hear even more at 12 o'clock at the press conference. Excellent. Can I just ask you a quick question before we move to the rest of the panel? Which is that, well, firstly, we're going to talk about netizens and how I think most people in this room will think, okay, well, it's about how, you know, people have come along and told politicians what they want through social media or kind of acted to circumvent them because they don't trust them. This is very much part of that engagement and a new style of engagement and empowerment. And it's a little bit more, it's a little less hostile in a sense, but it's also about grassroots. What are politicians supposed to take from this, from the results that you're about to present at 12 and you've showed us a little glimpse of at the moment?
I'll give you a personal view. The first thing I'd say is that we have a hell of a lot of high-profile politicians who come through this organisation. And this morning you heard Alenka Bratusek from Slovenia cite the Better Life Index herself. They're listening. I think the thing they're doing is they're looking at this with great attention. Because perhaps what we're looking at here as well is a shift, which is rather than the political landscape where you are used to having political parties that are inheriting perhaps origins, ideologies, etc., and are looking to convince the electorate of what they have, we need an inversion, which is actually to say, okay, what do you want? And let's listen to you, and then how can we adjust where we're coming from, either as politicians, either as political actors, and how we do it, but what we do should be a lot more driven by what you want, rather, if you like, than a sort of more top-down approach or an organized approach where you have very established political machines and political parties. And how we're doing it, the interesting thing I find is that if you've got over 4 million people engaging with something like this, then that civic engagement measure that we're seeing, I think the problem is not that people don't want to engage. I think there's a certain element to it, which is how they engage. And perhaps this is an example, it may be an example of how one can go forward in the future.
Anthony, I'm going to come back to you about some of those issues, because I think they also raise some interesting problems. On my left, I have John Worth. John Worth is a blogger. He's a trainer and consultant based in Berlin. He's a visiting lecturer at the University of Maastricht and a graduate and the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And he's previously run online campaigns. If you are from the UK, you'll know some of these, perhaps the Atheist Bust, and he's also helped successfully elect the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Harriet Harman, through social media, and somewhat less unsuccessfully, Ken Livingstone, who made it as mayor but then didn't make it as mayor. We won't touch on that yet. Can I ask you? Okay, I'm going to give you the hardest question, perhaps, because it's the first, but it's also the one that I think helps define the argument, which is or the discussion. What is a netizen? And you've got like 30 seconds. No, you've got a bit more.
Well, thank you. We've touched upon it to a certain extent. I think it's a person who uses the internet for civic and political purposes. For me, the important question behind that is, how do we define what civic and political purposes are, and do they have to be positive or negative? In the sense that if you were to compare, for example, Tahrir Square with the riots in North London in 2011, they were both organised using mobile phones to a certain extent. One was portrayed as being a good thing, one was portrayed as being a bad thing. Are those netizens in both of those cases or not? Is someone who is a civic hacker who brings down the website of an oppressive regime? Depends which side you're on, of whether they're a netizen or not. So I think you have to apply to that your own kind of personal values of what you think a citizen is. I think the activism on the net is the common part, whereas we then have to apply some kind of political ideology to it in addition.
So this also just reflects a question that we've got in from Wissembly. Already we're getting questions, so keep them coming. But I'm going to just sum it up in this, which is, as trust in government continues to lag, how are netizens sort of shaping this new form of civic engagement? Because clearly there almost seems to be sort of a contradiction there. They kind of don't want to have governments sort of telling them what they want to do, or they don't trust them. But at the same time, they're interacting more than ever to make sure that they get the governments to do what they want to do, or other authorities. So what's going on?
I think there is no direct contradiction between those things, because it's possible to use social media to kind of to see in, if you like, to improve transparency, to see and understand political processes. And it's also possible, as we've seen in numerous different countries, to mount online protest movements or complaints, or even complaints about particular pieces of legislation online. What we are yet to see, and I don't know whether we're ever necessarily going to see, is people who can actually achieve and sustain political power very easily using purely net tools. In the sense that it's easier to bring down a regime somewhere in Egypt or potentially in Turkey or the other examples, Bulgaria even, where you mount massive online protests, but to try to actually generate a functioning, workable government out of that is considerably harder. So I think therein lies the contradiction. So we can look in better than we ever could before, we can mobilize better than we could before, but we can't yet necessarily build the organizational structures in order to sustain that in a governmental sense.
Because that was one of the complaints within the Egyptian civic movement, that actually they were really good at sort of organizing people, but then they didn't have any program for government, if you want, once they toppled the dictator. And it was very easy, therefore, to enact a counter-revolution, if you want.
Exactly, and the question then comes as well to, how do you build trust, and how do you build strong personal relationships with people? You can start that online, but in the end, that face-to-face contact, those long-term engagements, actually really matter and really do deliver a result in politics. And that's what we have to find ways and means of getting towards. And that's one of the problems as well with the issue in Turkey for all the Gezi Park protests, is you can build an enormous protest movement very quickly, but trying to turn that into a functioning program moving forward in the medium term has proven very, very hard. So maybe you actually need to perhaps advance slightly slower at the beginning in order to manage to make sure that you know some of your end results before you've actually built your protest movement.
Thank you. And we're going to come to some of those issues a little bit later on as well. Eva, on my furthest left, if you want, is Eva Majewski. She is the chairwoman of the European Democratic Students, and is the official student organization, which is the official student organization of the European People's Party. EDS has 40 member organizations from 35 countries across Europe and represents 1.6 million students, and is hence the biggest political student organization around. Wow. So, how have you seen netizens organize? I don't think you have to press anything. It's just on.
It's already on.
It's ready.
Maybe now I'm...
It's ready for you to engage.
Well, first of all, the strength comes from our very own organizations that we have. So we do try to have the regional approach and languages that was pointed out by Anthony earlier on. Maybe one good example we had now in the uprun to the European elections, we had, as European People's Party, one big action program. So it's like the government program, coming up ideas for the next legislative period. And we introduced something called Up to Youth. And we actually managed to achieve, together with the Center for European Studies, to engage with 44,000 people. The average age was 25, so we actually managed to be where we wanted to be age-wise. There was 44,000 people from all across Europe and beyond who were ranking which are the priorities for them as well. And we managed to also ask for ideas and policies that should be implemented, and we made this a whole chapter in the action program. So once EPP might win the elections, we're going to see this being turned into law and into real policies.
So really what you're saying there is, you've engaged and that almost people are creating policy which you stand on. Okay. So let me ask you, and John has already touched on this a little bit, but are netizens just really, are they proper citizens in essence? Do they act in a kind of, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have this image of the agora in Greece, perhaps. Let's go right back to the beginning. And, sorry, we won't be there for very long. You sense that, these citizens are supposed to have interest in all sorts of affairs. They're well-rounded. Are these people on the internet like that? Or are they just really good at complaining? Are getting their way for one single issue? Are they in fact just super complainers and they've learned how to use these tools and God help us all?
Always wonder why you give young politicians always get the questions about complaining citizens, because we are the ones actually up in the front to change something in society. Yes, it sometimes complains. It's much easier maybe to post something nowadays with a quick comment, whereas back in the old days you had to sit down, write a letter, put a lot of thought into it before you mail it, you think over it before you move something forward. But I think it's just a new way. It's a different way. So it can be a complaint, but it also can be very often the sign of support. So actually this engagement that we had, for example, with the Up to Youth campaign, really helped us as the young generation to voice our concerns and our demands towards the mother party. Because we're not just the student and the youth organizations raising our opinions and what needs to be done in order to reach sustainable politics, but we had now from the campaign that was also initiated from the mother party backing us in other policies we wanted to see implemented. So it was a big support for us.
Thank you. One other question. Are politicians, because we've also seen this, I've seen this a lot in the UK almost every couple of weeks, some sort of person will tweet, usually a politician, they'll get in all sorts of trouble, and then there'll be a reaction, or something else will come along like that. Are politicians too fearful? Just I'm asking you now as kind of a politician, just generally, of viral reactions from netizens, from people on the internet, just generally?
I think it depends on the society. I come from Germany originally. Merkel, of course, she will have maybe 1 or 2 lines every once in a while that are then published on Twitter, on Facebook, but she has a whole team. If you look into Norway, different society, people would take their phones and take a picture to post it, or post a picture of the audience and see what they are doing. The Prime Minister now, Erna Solberg, takes a picture of her about her workout when she's walking up the stairs. It's a different kind of reaction what people want to see. They want to see the human being behind. Very often the citizen, so it has the human touch, actually trying to bridge that distance now that we have in the social media age. But I think some of them are afraid, and this is sometimes also why maybe things come too late, because a lot of thought is being put into each and every single word, what you put online, so that you do not have any misunderstandings. So this is a lot of language that needs to be filtered, and it's not as spontaneous as it could be, only because of that fear. Yeah.
Before I come to Ken Bluestone, I'm just going to ask the audience, just for a quick show of hands, very quick thing. Who here has a smartphone? Okay, everyone, almost, just about. Who here uses Facebook? And keep your hands up. And who uses Twitter on a regular basis? Who uses Twitter on a regular basis? Okay, so okay, so we've got a I don't know, John, did you see those votes? Were you too busy engaging on Twitter? You were too busy, in fact, engaging on Twitter. I was going to ask you whether you thought we had an engaged audience on kind of your average ratios. Yes?
Yes, in comparison to most political audiences, yes, definitely.
Right, well done. I don't think if you get any special prizes, unfortunately, the OECD can't afford bags for everyone or something. But there we go. Now, let me ask you, let me turn to the person on my right, Ken Bluestone. He leads AIDS International's influencing work on issues affecting older people in lower and middle income countries. Now I'm going to ask you that awkward question we discussed before. Gear up for it. Well, so we've seen in Syria kind of how it's been described as the most socially mediated conflict in history, but they've often used tools, and people in Egypt, Ukraine, Turkey have used these tools to much effect, and everyone agrees with that. But is it just someone who can use Twitter or Instagram or upload into YouTube who is part of this world? Or is this world actually more broader than just social media? We often just focus on that. So the BLI is perhaps a good example. You don't need Twitter to fill in your preferences on the BLI.
Right. So, as I said, I'm not going to talk about Syria. But what this is really about is the extent to which technology is actually excluding potentially part of the population. And if you go back to that slide that Anthony had on the screen, where you had the different age groups, and then you had the 65 plus, which was 3%, when you superimpose that over the actual numbers, the percentages, the proportions of the population, here in Europe, you're looking at 29, 30, 35% in some countries, huge numbers of the population who are actually over the age of 60. This is not just, by the way, a developed world phenomenon. We're talking about this globally. So at the moment, the number of people over the age of 60, 2/3 of them living in developing countries. In 15, 20 years' time, that's going to change to 4/5. So, population aging is not just OECD anymore. It is global. So the big question is, netizens, civic engagement, political engagement, to what extent is this technology potentially reinforcing inequality, because those people, a huge percentage of the population, simply don't have access to it, don't understand it, aren't using it.
But on the other hand, you kind of have this notion of the silver surfer. So you've got this generation of the baby boomers who are round about 47 to 67, maybe a bit older now, who are in fact quite good at using the internet, and also politically, traditionally, certainly in America and the UK and in other places, have been very good at getting their preferences heard by politicians and demanding the kinds of things they want, and having that dealt with. Now, if they can also use the internet and co-opt those tools as well, maybe the silver surfers will sort of take over in the next 20 years. Is that another way of casting that problem?
Does this have to be an either or? I mean, it's not take over. That sounds rather sinister.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because it is actually quite rare for younger people, 15 to 24, to be heard by politicians, I think. Yeah. In a kind of sensible way, without me again going on they're just complaining kind of thing, right? That's usually the retort. Whereas older people, they vote, so they're not complaining. They're citizens, proper citizens. Is there that issue? You don't see that issue?
Well, look, I think it cuts two things here. I think it cuts both ways. I think that the amount of exclusion in terms of the political process that older people face is just as much. What happens is that there is, look, the Prime Minister of Slovenia today was the first time I have ever heard a head of state actually talking about population aging as an opportunity. It was a huge transformation to hear people start to think about this demographic reality. The fact is, younger people today are going to be the older people tomorrow. So this isn't about one group against another. This is about how we engage in political processes across our life course. We do see right now, of course, there is a huge amount of engagement, use of this technology. I think where we're at with netizenship, though, is that effectively this is a tool that allows us to engage in traditional structures more effectively. You've got from information to revolution, right? So, you've got the information being provided, you've got people being able to engage with their democratic representatives more effectively. We've seen this in the UK in terms of older people by using online surveys, by using emailing their politicians. They were able to change legislation that actually affects the human rights of older people. This is something that didn't happen 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So the use of these technologies, I think the extent to which we go into the future is where we envisage a future that there is a political engagement that requires netizenship. That's the problem, because where you have to have that access to the internet, where you have to be skilled, then you're automatically excluding a huge part of the population.
Let me just, as a quick follow-up, ask you then, instead of looking at as kind of age differentials, what about exclusion in terms of class? What do you know about engagement from poorer sections of society? My feeling would be obviously that they tend to be less on the internet, less engaged politically anyway. Is this going to be even more detrimental to them and to those groups to hearing their voices making sure their voices get heard? I'm talking about within countries.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know that much about it, but it chimes with a global conversation that's going on. I mean, right now, as we're speaking here, there's another conversation going on in New York. It's around kind of what framework, what set of goals are going to be put in place to tackle poverty after the Millennium Development Goals finish in 2015. Inequality is one of the big issues. We heard it again this morning from Jason Furman. So this question of haves and have-nots in society and that widening gap, I think, is only replicated by netizenship as well.
Okay, I'm going to come out to the audience, to the internet, shortly for questions. So get them prepared, and as I said, you can ask them through Assembly, or you can just, in your old-fashioned way, put your hands up. We can get a microphone to come to you. But before I do, again, just a quick show of hands from the audience here. Who's actually ever voted on the internet? Ooh. The person that do you happen to be from Estonia by any chance? The people of Mac there who put your hand up, the gentleman there. Are you from Estonia? Just shout yes or no. No, you voted on the internet. Okay, but okay, you're not from Estonia. Okay, well, if this audience was from Estonia, then about 25% of you would be putting up your hands, because Estonia is perhaps one of the few countries in which allows and which has the systems and capabilities, and has done since about 2005, for its citizens to vote for politicians on the internet, which is amazing. It's incredible that more countries haven't adopted it in some senses, and that Estonia has in fact led the way. We have the OECD's ambassador from Estonia here with us in the front row, Martin Koch. I'm just going to ask you, so why did Estonia decide to go down this route, and how has it sort of panned out?
Thank you, Shiv. And a very good morning to all of you as well. I am Martin Koch. I'm the Estonian ambassador here in the OECD, and I'll very briefly tell you how this e-government or and e-voting things work back home. To put it to the Estonian context, we're only talking about voting via the internet, and all these things started in 2002 when we adopted a mandatory ID card system. It's like this, looks like a little bit like Carte Vitale, but it's very different in essence, which means that all the Estonian citizens are identifiable easily via internet. So, and we use it for everything now. We use it for internet banking. We use it for tax declarations. We use it for police. If you're stopped by police in Estonia, they will just scan your ID card and see, do you have still some things to pay, or should you be detained or let go? So, and also they can check about the insurance and everything. And also if you go to the public transport in Estonia, the controller comes and they can check with the ID card reader that are you entitled to travel free on this bus. So, and having all those services on the ID card base, the idea of having a voting on internet also came along very easily. And in 2005 we had the first voting on municipal elections with the ID card. And in practice it works very, very, very easily. You have this card, you have two PIN codes, and you need an ID card reader and a computer connected to internet. And then you download very, very quickly. It takes you like 30 seconds, a brief bit of software, which gives you then to whom you can vote. Then you vote using this PIN code and the cards, and then they are counted on the general elections, and they are legally binding. And on the last elections in 2011, the general elections, a little bit less than 25% voted via this system on the general elections, and we have seen always the increase of participation via this system by people, and then because it enables people with disabilities and people being abroad to access the elections more easily.
Martin, well, why did Estonia decide to do this? Because it is often the argument is put, in the UK or wherever it may be, that okay, well, it's too difficult to do, it's insecure, you're going to have these problems, but it seems like a remarkable way for people. It's very convenient, right? Presumably. So why did Estonia go down this route?
Well, I think, to be very honest with you, that when we adopted this overall ID card infrastructure, it was already expensive. So we needed to do some services with it. And
value
for money, yes.
Right, okay.
You use it for every purpose you can. And it was very, very well adopted by the private sector as well. All the banks switched immediately to that identification, as it was safer and quicker. And then now I think all the services government delivers are delivered through this ID card infrastructure. Now,
Estonia might be a wonderful and very friendly place, but do you fear for the problems of big data now? If everything is tapped into that one card, what happens when you lose it? Your life must be over. And two, are you worried that the problems of kind of as I said, big government kind of then we can spot where you're doing and what you're doing now, and maybe 20 years hence government won't be so friendly. You got all sorts of problems.
Thank you for this question. It is a debate about it, of course. As when it comes to the elections, all those votes are encrypted so that the government can't access them directly in a way. And
can the NSA decrypt it? Do we know? You can't tell.
They probably
okay.
can.
Okay.
I don't know. but it's a little bit of a trade-off that you get your services quicker and you have some risks. If you lose this card, it can be replaced in 2 days. So you have 2 days to pay differently for your bus or but otherwise it goes very quickly. It works very smoothly. You can get it substituted also when you're abroad very quickly. So I think my card expired somewhere in February, and in 2 weeks I had a new one. So this hasn't been a problem really.
Remarkable. Thank you very much. It's incredibly helpful to know that. And I guess the question must be the wider question, which I'll leave hanging, is why haven't other governments yet adopted this? I know that most of my friends would certainly, who are my age, would vote. It's just more convenient to vote over the internet. But let's go out to the audience for questions. We're just a couple of questions for the moment, and then we're going to go back to the panel, and we're going to raise some of these problems, actually. It's not all bread and roses with netizens. So we've got a lady at the front here who's going to go first, bravely. She's already smiling because she's slightly nervous.
I'm just smiling because I think this is getting a bit meta, because my question is being shown on the screen right now that I've just tweeted at you.
Okay.
So my question is, as you can see.
And John said he's already answered it on Twitter.
Oh. Well,
we've already done all of this.
Well, maybe I should just check my @replies. But I think everyone else would like to hear, how representative do Twitter and Facebook remain as youth choose to move to more private networks like WhatsApp and Snapchat?
Twitter. Okay. Right. John, you've already answered it, so go and answer it for everyone else that we can all hear.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and certainly there's a lot of analysis being done about that kind of change of behavior. I think the important point is the question, is it open and public communication or private one-to-one communication, and what that means for politics? The advantage of Twitter overall has been its openness, and everyone can read everything, and that's a great way of doing open collaboration and a great way of reaching individual politicians. Facebook's a bit more complicated. It's a combination of both private and open. WhatsApp or Snapchat or their many equivalents is essentially a one-to-one, and indeed then also potentially encrypted when means of communication. So therefore, I think that's, for me, the most important question. We also have to move to thinking a little bit differently as well, because the move to smartphones and tablets rather than people sat behind regular PCs means it's as easy to switch from one app to another as it is to switch between two functions within one app, i.e. to switch the messenger function in Facebook from your newsfeed is just as easy as switching from Facebook to WhatsApp or to Snapchat or whatever other. So therefore, I think we need to start to think about what are the different ways and means of tools of using mobile phones and tablets as the platform to a certain extent, and the applications which would be appropriate to reach the largest possible audience there. What I think, one final point as well, we've got to be very wary of is we've all seen what's happened on Facebook and increasingly on Twitter, which is they're free services which are free to use, and we all get bombarded by too much advertising. And so therefore, any political engagement which moves onto those platforms has to be very, very careful that you're just kind of not using those same old things which are turning people off increasingly from Twitter and Facebook. So I think that's a danger for whatever technologies may come along in the future.
John, while you're still talking, can I just ask, you've helped on the other side, if you want, politicians, namely Harriet Harman, successfully engage with voters in her case, using social media tools. What tools did you use? Now, obviously, that was a few years ago, so they may be totally outdated now. And how, again, how did that in essence work, and how was that favourable to winning the election?
That was back in 2007 with Harriet Harman. So she was actually writing her own blog, and she was the only candidate in the deputy leadership election at that point who was doing that.
2007 means Twitter had just come along?
Twitter had come along. We were already
Okay.
Facebook was already starting to boom in the UK. I think the important point there is she's a good politician in writing, better than she's a politician perhaps in audio-visual. So she actually genuinely likes writing, so that actually matches her as a character. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the broad question, which is the point to draw out, which is politicians who have an interesting story to tell themselves do interesting things and are good, open, communicative people. You can give them the right combination of technology. It helps draw out their individual characters. And all of the campaigns I've done with different politicians since then, it's always been putting that individual personalization at the heart of it. And politicians who are at ease with that, they realize that in the end, if they do say a word wrong here or there, that's not the end of the world, and that they can apologize for that. That's part of the reason why, in response to the point earlier on, I don't think Angela Merkel is very good, but certain other German politicians are much better at social media. Michel Roth, for example, of the SPD, who's the State Secretary for European Affairs, he's much better at it because he's a much more lively and engaging character, and he can therefore excel in social media. I don't think that Merkel would herself be particularly good at expressing herself in 140 characters.
We'll leave that hanging. Do we have any other questions from the audience for that in this first part? If anyone's confused, by the way, at this point, here's the time to, yes, there's a lady over there. I don't know whether she's confused or not. But if you are, here's the time to ask some clarificatory questions before we go into the second part, which is going to be about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Yes, the lady at the back there. Yeah.
So how would you suggest we get older people engaged in technology?
Great. Ken?
Fantastic question. I mean, look, it starts with being able to recognize where they're coming from. First of all, sometimes this is just a question of familiarity, because this is a technology that developed, you know, and also I have to say, let's be brutally honest here, this is a generational thing. So we're talking about the older people of today. We're not talking about the older people of 20 years from now, because there's a whole generation of people who grew up with this technology. So for people who did not grow up with it, what really works for us is sitting down with them, actually making the time. Also, you know, there's a real challenge out there for software developers, the people who have these apps, you know, to think about accessibility, how easy is it to read things on the screen, simplifying functions. You know, if you want to really use this technology to engage people, you're going to have to make it easy for them. And what really works is actually getting the people who know how to do this really well to sit down with the people who don't. So having this kind of intergenerational connection where you've got the empowered users, the younger generation, showing older people how to do it. Once people get it, they never look back, and actually it becomes a huge phenomenon.
Before we go into our second part, we've got one more question. Go on. Go ahead. It's a lady in the fifth row there. Just over here. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you, sorry. I had a question about this kind of positive and negative side of the users and these netizens, because we were thinking about, are they complainers or are they citizens? And is that to do with their right to vote or engage, or whether they use social media for positive or negative, and the riots and revolution, and what's the difference? And is it that we have to just reach a critical mass of engagement, and so we can assume that most people are using it for good? Or how do we, this kind of the ideology behind it and this positive and negative, do you have any comments or ideas when we can define netizens as positive people?
Oh, we're not defining them as positive or negative yet. We're going to get to that bit. But I don't know. Maybe John wants to say something very quickly, because I know Ava could have answered that question before from her point. Anthony, do you want to add to that as well?
I'd just say they are. It's a little bit like one of the issues that we're grappling with at this forum, which is aging. Now, what word do you use? In French, it's vieillissement. And there are sort of some negative connotations around these words. So we've come up with the title, The New Age is what we're using for the Idea Factory. It is, what is right and wrong? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, we're just seeing it now in terms of the results I showed you. If you're sitting in one part of the world, the most important thing to you is this. If you're sitting in another part of the world, the most important thing to you is that. The right and wrong question it's a difficult one, because you can enter. I mean, you can obviously enter into sort of some very deep debates about these issues. But there is also, I think, a question of your vantage point. Do you mind, Shiv, if there's a couple of things I just wanted to mention very briefly on the back of the exchanges that have been had so far. I mean, because I want to link it a little bit to our own experience. We talked about the use of smartphones and mobile platforms. This is part of the reason why we've gone from 24,000 to 60,000 indexes this year. We know. So it's language on the one hand. It's also the fact that it's easy for you. There you are sitting with your phone or your iPad. It's really easy to do that index now. So that makes a big difference. Second thing, you were asking about Facebook, Twitter. Again, I'll give you an example from us. Most of the people engaging through social media, and this was designed in a way to make it was an experiment for us, which was, okay, make this available in that way, and what will happen? We didn't know. Facebook is the big one. Why? Because it allows you to share your index. That is a more difficult thing. You can't do that in 140 characters. You can take someone somewhere, but the Facebook thing is critical there. So it's sort of an answer in a way to why some and why not the others. I'm also very interested by what Ken said regarding the questions of inequality. This is something that we really do need to take seriously. I'd probably say, at least in what I've heard so far, there's the question of compliments. Let's not say it's all netizens, it's all Estonia. Well, there's Estonia, and Estonia's managed to get up to 25%. Good for Estonia. You know, they've just joined the OECD, and they're light years ahead of all the other countries. So they're setting the pace, and so be it. But you could have a combination of things. The last point for me picks up on Ken again, but where I disagree, I'd say, which is you touched on it, Shiv. The generations who are, say, 35 now, in 2050, your heat map, fantastic heat map, Ken, of HelpAge, showing the elderly populations or how populations will age over time, they will be there. Who knows what we will have in 30 years' time, but the only way is that, in a sense, and it's going to be global. So I think there is a clear growth pattern that we have to acknowledge, and that this is something that's certainly not going away. It's going to grow, if anything.
John, I'm not going to answer that. We're going to come to that in a bit. I hope that served as an answer. Don't worry, we've got plenty of time for more questions. Ava, I'm going to also put you on hold for a second. I know you wanted to say some stuff. I'm going to come back to you in a bit. But I do have a question for the audience, another question. But this time, I want you to answer this over our Wissembly services. At the back of it, we've got the question up. Well, the question I wanted to put up was that, do you think the internet makes people more or less likely to engage with politics and with community? We're going to have the question up in a second, hopefully. Are we going to have the question up in a second? Yes? Yes! Oh my God, amazing. Now, that might seem like a little bit of a confusing question, but we're going to explore some of those issues. So you've got 20 minutes to make up your mind, yes or no. Do you think the internet makes people more or less likely to engage with politics and with community? Because I don't think it's a straightforward answer. Okay. So, now, I am a journalist, and not only do I like to pry deeper, but I also like to pick out the negative aspects and the problems, because they kind of make for a better, or certainly more interesting debate, perhaps, from my perspective. But there are genuinely some issues with this, which we should explore. As I said, it's not just a question, it's all rosy, it's all wonderful, isn't it great? Because there are some serious problems, which hopefully that question will give some food for thought. John, you touched upon some of this. when you mentioned that actually, these revolutionaries in Egypt realized, and you said, and I think you mentioned also Turkey, when they managed to topple a government or get close to it, but they had no program for government afterwards. And you mentioned that actually the old-fashioned face-to-face, what we're doing here, is actually much more of a bonding experience. Malcolm Gladwell has picked up on this, and what he framed it as is that the internet's very good at weak ties. It's very convenient, it's very easy, people press a button, or vote or put their signature on a poll, and that's it, they go away, right? But when you have these stronger ties, like forming a party, turning up at events, you really become a lot more solidified. And it's a lot easier to actually affect proper, real lasting change. What do you think? Do you think that the internet's just making us very sort of good at pressing buttons, but bad at actually developing, changing the world properly?
I think that's a slightly negative way of putting it. There's this concept of the so-called slacktivist, which is kind of someone who just clicks online activity and expects change to happen. What I think is very important, and this comes out of my own personal experience as well, is those weak ties are a good start to transform those into much stronger ties, which you can then really deliver really major change. The people I've built the biggest campaigns with, we've communicated online first, we've sat down around tables to talk, and that solidarity that's built over a dinner or a beer or a coffee then actually really delivers the result. Now, I've found some of my best work counterparts, some of my best political counterparts, thanks to online engagement, first and foremost, people who've read my blog, people who I follow and follow me on Twitter, and we then take that offline, and then that turns into real organizational change, and that's from one to the other. The thing is that I ask myself this question when I'm involved, when I see any political problem in front of me. What can I do online to start to begin to change that issue? Yeah? And that's always the question. So when I'm traveling quite often, I flew here today, but I'm normally traveling by train, and when things break down, what do I do? Here I am, I'm stuck at a border somewhere and my train is broken down. Or I'm stuck at a border and I'm subject to an illegal passport control because there's not supposed to be passport controls in Schengen, but there still are. What do I do about that here and now? How do I build that network online and then take that then to the offline environment in terms of then building campaigning organizations or meeting politicians face-to-face in order to talk about it, and using ingenuity and creativity and jokes and fun and parody in order to manage to deliver those sorts of results. So I think what Gladwell has never really, and perhaps maybe as someone from born of perhaps the kind of pre-internet era, has never lived some of that kind of transition, if you like. For me, it's been central to all of the politics I've ever done. I built my first website as a student, as I was the first year in the UK that was opposed to student tuition fees. I was the first year that had to pay that in the UK. So that was my first experience. We have no money. We need to reach a major audience. What the hell are we going to do? And I've been doing that more or less ever since. But it's very, very important that it can't only purely be that online engagement.
Eva, let me ask you that exact same question. Do you think that people are becoming, in a sense, slacktivists? They're very, it's convenient. It is very easy to engage over the internet as compared to turning up to a meeting on a cold, wet evening at 7 o'clock and saying, yes, I'm with this party, I'm with this community group. And people aren't even really like that anymore, perhaps. And it's very convenient to therefore do all of this over the internet, actually to the detriment of bonding a group of people and solidifying them and making them very powerful in that way.
I think it's yes and no. I think for some people who like to have stability in their lives, they might still, join a party and follow the broad stream. But what has happened now during the last couple of years within parties, and this on a national and also on a European level, that yes, we do not function as we used to. Yes, there were meetings every Thursday evening, 7 p.m., open-end, whatever. And then touching on this or that topic. But now we are thinking much more as politicians in task force. We start working groups which are really terminated after a year, and they are focusing on one particular issue, and then try to look, okay, how can we engage with other civil society groups to find a solution? How can we get the knowledge we need and the competency as a party? Because all the issues to be solved are way more complex nowadays than they were maybe 20, 30 years ago. So I think the way we do politics also has already changed in that sense. So how do you come in maybe as an, well, we are all normal citizens, so I don't like this differentiation to say you're a politician, not a politician. But people are more likely to join civil society groups who are focusing on one particular issue because it's easier, way faster in the topic. People go to a human rights group, Amnesty International, join these groups but not parties anymore. But then it's the question, how can you engage together with those groups to make things happen in the end? And this is the challenge for politicians. But I think, you know, by opening up and reaching and saying, okay, now for this next 6 months we are going to focus on this particular topic is the way to move forward.
John, I know sorry, Ken, I know that you wanted to come in on that.
Hello, there we go. Look, just also reflecting back on the question that was asked, is netizenship positive or negative? It's technology. So, you know, technology is neutral. We don't ask the question, is picking up a phone and speaking to someone positive or negative, is sending an email positive or negative? It's what is it this is actually doing for us in terms of our engagement? And that's, for me, the really exciting bit, is picking up something that Eva said. You know, what we see that's very different is the fact that people are able to engage outside the formal political structures in a way which is we've never seen before, on single issues, on the things that interest them. Where we haven't arrived yet, though, and where we're still anchored, I think, to that this is basically just another way of the traditional political engagement, which is not a bad thing, but it's just recognizing it for what it is that we don't yet have, I think, is the feedback loop and mechanism. So single issues. So where I think netizenship is really going to come into its own is when you have a politician or you have a government that recognizes, that sees there's this online campaign that's happened, we're going to change policy on the basis of that, and we're going to feedback and recognize the people who did this, that this is the reason why we changed policy, because you've had that engagement with us.
So here's another worry, Ken. So we live in an age where we don't have much ideology, or people aren't ideologically engaged in the way that they once used to. The internet is also famed for being putting people into silos. So it's also quite hard to discover what you don't already know on the internet. It's not very good at that. So it's not like sitting in front of a teacher and the teacher will tell you all sorts of things. Instead, you kind of go there and you search on Google, and presumably you already know what you're searching for. Now this is worrying for me. And does it worry you? When it's quite hard to discover other people's views, are you going to end up with just people being A, very single issue, and B, actually not listening to other people, their other fellow netizens, right? Just very hostile to other points of view.
Yeah, I mean, completely. I mean, that's the reality of today. And you know, one thing we haven't all discussed as well is, you know, we're thinking this, I think, still very much within a kind of an OECD European wealthier country mentality. But those 4/5 of the population who are going to be older in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, you know, they are actually, what we're not seeing is that same evolution of technology that's engaging them. So how you know, it's not just how do we get access to this information and kind of where we're being left out of the themes, you know, today as we're doing it, but, you know, where is this leading us to? Because I think that's this real potential for this technology to actually increase the divide that exists between countries as well.
Eva, we've heard a little bit about what Estonia is doing. We could even envisage perhaps, you know, where you have a third chamber, and where you have citizens scrutinizing or putting forth policy that they want to see. The BLI gives a bit of a flavor of that. Do we actually need politicians at all? Aren't you? Isn't this putting you out of a job potentially?
I'm not employed as I'm not voted in as a politician or anything like this, huh? So I'm officially NGO, not political party. So I still think we do need politicians, because actually what we do with our vote is to delegate further what needs to then be executed. And this is why, for me, casting a vote is very important. Yes, there are enough people who don't think that their vote can change anything, but this is actually the whole thing, like, how do you bring change? And yes, you can complain, but who's going? And everyone's saying, oh, then we go and talk to the politicians. Hello, just demand a meeting. I mean, this is the whole thing. It's just this easy. You can write 2 sentences and have a face-to-face meeting with politicians as well. And this is actually quite easy. I was surprised how easily it can be to get a meeting. With commissioners of the European Union, it's not a problem. You just send them an email and it will happen. And you just must have an issue or a thing you want to change and work on. So it's very often that I think what needs to be done is when you try to think, okay, do we need politicians? Yes, I think there needs to be someone in charge, and that someone needs to be accountable. So this is why there should be the check also through social media, and you can have now it much easier than every 4 or 5 years that someone is accountable, because now you have this additional control that's not coming in every year, but it's coming in every single day through social media. So I think it is necessary, because everything is again too specialized nowadays, so you need someone to actually make a decision at the end of the day, because not every citizen can fulfill and be an expert on every single issue.
So here's another issue. Maybe this is also one for Anthony. We haven't got very long left at all. And I want to go out for the audience for a few more questions. There's an issue with this, isn't there, as well, with something like the BLI or certainly the deeper notion that you can make policy simply by asking people, which is that ordinary people have, one, bad time preference. So they don't see things about the future that, over 20 years, they tend to think about the things that bother them now. And they're sometimes incoherent with their choices. So they say, well, look, I quite like healthcare, but I also like lower taxes. Well, hang on, you can't have both. So we might think of this as wonderful, super responsive policy making and purely sort of good, sort of democratic work. But actually, is this also terrible governance over the long term? That more responsible thing to do. Anthony, how does the BLI also get around this? Briefly, you've got 1 minute.
Yeah, it's excellent question. I think. Firstly, one of the things that we're looking at exploring, which answers your point about finite resources in a way, is to give people a currency. It wouldn't be a coin, because it would be more along the lines of a heart, because what is it that you are giving value to? But to give a finite value, then ask people to share that currency around the 11 dimensions, rather than give them the opportunity at the moment, as they have, to give everything 5 or give everything, be extremely generous. So that's one of the things. Now, looking at policymaking, I tell you what I think is the fundamental thing. One of the things that got this whole initiative going was begun back in the early 2000s by the then chief economist, the chief statistician, sorry. And it was, do we need to move beyond GDP? Because one of the things that did, and I don't know that anybody voted for that, to make GDP the measure of success. And yet, here we were, every year, saying, oh, the GDP of country X has risen to this, fantastic, we're all doing really well. And now we're discovering that actually the concentrations of wealth, 30% of the wealth or 40% of the wealth lies with the top 1%. Wow, okay, so we're in trouble there. So it's not as though before we were doing too well. What we're doing now, I think, is we are genuinely asking a question. That question is coming back with answers which are self-selecting, and of course we need to broaden the community and contrast it with people who are not coming to the index or being encouraged to the index. But if you've already got 60,000 people out of almost 4 million who bothered to do this, and they are telling you certain things, I think that has some value. One shouldn't dismiss it out of hand. And the trick then for policy making, I think, is to be in listening mode. We're at the start of something. Let's see how it develops. We've probably got to refine it. I mean, okay, so if you're interested in safety, tell me more. Because at the moment, our index only captures 2 dimensions around safety. And they don't respond to what the Japanese are really worried about at the moment. They have the highest levels of security and safety in the classic sense of the word, crime and stuff like that. So they're super safe. But they're not safe against a dirty great big wave or a nuclear accident, or they weren't. They've obviously taken many steps since. So there are a lot of things that we need to do, I think, to refine. But I wouldn't put too much on it, in a sense, to say, oh, well, let's dismiss it out of hand because this isn't. At the same time, well, maybe we're onto something and it's taking us somewhere. We're on a trip. The important thing, I think, is that if we hadn't had almost 4 million people, if we hadn't had 60,000 indexes, we wouldn't be discussing, I wouldn't have bothered you today with all the stuff that we had.
Good point. Okay, let's go out to the audience for some final questions. And also, of course, our vote. Why don't, in fact, is everyone voting now? Can we get people to vote now? For that question, I'll remind you of the question again. Now we've had a little bit of a discussion about it. Do you think the internet makes people more or less likely to engage with politics and with community? Because obviously they can be divided by it. They can turn out to be not very good citizens or just very good complainers. Or on the other hand, they've got all of these convenient tools at hand and they're likely to get off their chair and actually say, yes, you know what? Let's engage on this or that issue. Can we call out to the audience for a vote? Yes? Is he shaking his head? Or is he not? Yes. People are voting now. We're going to get the results. Just shout out. Should we wait for a minute to get the results? Yes. He's saying yes. Okay. All right. Let's wait for a minute. Do we have any other questions? Hands up, or I can take it from here. At the moment, I don't have any questions on this. Did anyone else have any other points they wanted to raise? No. Not very engaged. Oh yes. There we go. 2 questions are all coming at the same time.
Sorry, yeah. Just a brief comment on, I think one of the previous interventions mentioning that the format of the new technologies do not matter for the content. I really think if you look at like the history in broadcasting, in the press, in the national press, in the newspapers, in digital media and social media in particular, that format changes the substance and the discussions a lot. And I think that's rather important for this discussion as well, because I think it was also pointed out in the beginning. I think the important thing is also what do we want to achieve by the notion of citizenship? How do we want to like fill out the role of citizens? What is the importance of citizenship in a democracy? And I think also to complement a little bit the Estonian, I think the Estonian experience is very interesting, but I also think that it's important for us to look at what happens between the elections, not only at election day, but what is the dialogue that we want to nurture between the elections. And I think in this context, it would be interesting to hear the panel a little bit about like what we can see with digital media is that we have an increasing presence of feelings, we have an increasing speed, and we have perhaps also an increasing amount of these weak relations in the political discussions. What does this mean? And given the still emergent digital context that our democracies are facing, how do we foresee an actual like digital democracy, a digital debate? That would be interesting to hear some reflections on this. Yeah.
2 parts of that question. I'm going to ask you what digital democracy might look like. But first, John, do you want to answer the first part of that?
I agree very much with that, because it was not my comment that you were replying to, and I was kind of frowning, and so I'm with you on that point. On terms of what a digital democracy looks like, the difficulty is we're trying to kind of apply our old models to how we know that democracy works to a globalized and digitized environment. I'm often asked, well, can we form a public sphere online to build a European public if we've currently got 28 national publics in all European Union countries? Well, the answer to that is, to a certain extent, yes, but it's not going to look like a national political debate is going to look like. It's going to be messy. It's going to have hundreds of different actors participating in it. It's nevertheless also not going to be horizontal and totally networked and hierarchical, non-hierarchical. It's assumed that there is flat participation online, but that's not true, or at least it's not true the more years we use it, because strength and influence coalesces around some major players within that network. So we will get there in an iterative and messy manner. And then finally, also to the point which was raised earlier on, do we need politicians? Within that, of course, we absolutely do need politicians. And this comes back to also to Anthony's point, which is those 60,000 people participating in that means something. We just don't quite know what. And what happens if there's something that's on the other side? Take, for example, if all of the people voting in using the index are saying they want a priority on healthcare, but the industries in a country concerned don't want investment in healthcare because actually they want to keep their social payments low. And you have 10 big companies that don't want increasing social security costs versus 60,000 citizens in an online petition that do. Who is going to resolve that dispute between a strong business interest versus a mass online expressed citizen interest? Well, a politician has got to be the person who's got to be able to resolve that sort of dispute. But that's an imbalanced sort of dispute, and we're only beginning to learn how to deal with those sorts of things.
Politicians, if you're out there, your job is still safe. Let's go to the vote. We've got actually minus 30 seconds left. So what's the results of the vote? Can we get that up there? Yes? Ooh, more likely. Everyone says it's more likely, pretty much, except for the 9% of those the 1 in 10 who are doubting that this is a good thing. Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for coming along. I think we've certainly learned a lot about potentially the new ways in which people will be engaging civically over the internet, over social media tools in the next, 10, 15 years, and even now and even today. There are clearly some problems with it, perhaps foreshadowing that sort of the 10% one in doubters who are kind of wondering whether it will make us better citizens or not. But nonetheless, we've discussed a lot, and there's a lot to look forward to. Thank you so much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the day.